All right. So this, when we talk about Israel's update and we set these things, with the dates far in advance, sometimes we have a lot to talk about. And sometimes, we do say that in Israel, there's never a dull moment, but there is sometimes more to talk about than other times. But this time we have a lot to talk about because exactly 1 week ago, we had elections. And, as you know, because we've talked about this often, and I know you are really following the news about Israel, for more than 3 years now, Israel has been in a cyclone of instability. We had a number of elections that failed to put together a government. So we had temporary governments and transitional governments. And then we had a government just now, this past year and a bit, that was a weird government. And I am an eternal optimist. So even this government, which did things that were, or let's say had combinations of parties that were a little odd, because the head of the government was Naftali Bennett and it did have a significant right-wing participation, I was certainly willing to give it credit and hope for the best and believe that in any case, this is a government that could do good for Israel. Excuse me, and I do believe it did good for Israel in certain things. Unfortunately, it also didn't do good for Israel in other things, and which you could really say about most governments anyway. But what happened was that by the end of the term of that government, the various ideological differences between the various parties begin to break down. And so it became clear that it was not going to be possible to continue working together as a government because there were too many things that they were not agreeing on. While at the same time, the opposition, headed up by Benjamin Netanyahu, was not just being an opposition to policies and legislation that they didn't agree with, but they were preventing even legislation that they did agree with because it became their overall goal was to bring down the government, which was something that was disturbing to a lot of people, even on the right. So as we walked into these elections, I would say that overall in the country, whether you were coming from the right or coming from the left, there was a lot of hesitation. First of all, there was a feeling of, oh no, another election campaign? And so there was great fear that there would be a very low voter turnout because people were fairly certain that it would be difficult, once again, to come to some kind of real, definitive understanding of what the country wants and what kind of government we can put together. At the same time, there was a lot of mixed messages going on. So on the one hand, you had people who are right-wing, who were very eager to bring the Likud and some of their other parties back into the government. And yet, on the other hand, there were people that were very angry with the right, the Likud and the Religious Zionist Party in particular, for blocking legislation that was good for Judea and Samaria just in order to bring down the government. So there was, in other words, whereas in the past, you would normally be able to say, well, let's see how many people agree with this particular policy, or I could even say more generally, who's right wing? Well, then they'll vote for these parties, and who's left wing? Well, they'll vote for these parties. What was created in Israel was a lot of gray in that area. So one example of that was the a party called the National Unity Party, and that was headed by Gantz. Gantz was many years ago, he was the chief of staff of the IDF, a lot of military experience. And then for this particular election campaign, he had been identified on the left. Okay, that was where he put himself and his party and his previous political affiliations were always teaming up with left-wing people. During this past government, he was the Minister of Defense, and as such was responsible, unfortunately, because Judea and Samaria has not been annexed, is not part of sovereign Israel, so to speak, in the same way as Tel Aviv or wherever. Therefore, unfortunately, much of the ordinary civilian activity that goes on in Judea and Samaria with regard to just regular Jews living in our communities comes in under the authority of the defense ministry, as opposed to under the authority of your ordinary, let's say, Ministry of the Interior, Health Ministry, or any of these other things. In Judea and Samaria, the Defense Ministry is on top of everything. And so there were some decisions that were made there, or for example, the government had agreed to establish a new community called Evyatar, and they did not implement that decision. And there was a feeling that it was Gantz himself, the head of that party, who was then the Ministry of Defense, who was preventing that. On the other hand, in putting together a brand new party for this election, his list was really a combination of right and left. He had some definite right-wing people in his team, and he had left-wing people in his team. And in fact, when the right-wing people joined his party, I was very distressed because I'm thinking, why are you creating such confusion? We don't have enough confusion. Why can't the right wing stay with the right wing and the left wing stay with the left wing? Anyway, that's just one example of what was going on. The other thing that people were really feeling as they went into the elections was an overwhelming desire for a definitive answer, that the result of these elections should point definitely in the direction of a particular government without having to make these weird combinations of right and left that don't naturally go together. What we came out of these elections, so first of all, the election day itself, surprising everybody, was the very high voter turnout. Okay, among the highest voter turnout in decades. And that was very, very good. And there was a great deal of investment made in, ironically, in the Arab communities to up their voter turnout. That investment was made by the left-wing parties. Even though all of these left-wing parties said they would not they would not include in their government these Arab parties that were still very anti-Israel, very anti-Zionist. But they felt, because it's a numbers game and statistics and all that kind of thing, even so, the higher voter turnout in those areas would mean that the left had more votes on its side. It sounded weird. I didn't understand it. I understood it, didn't like it. Okay, but what nobody expected was the extent to which the right wing got out an enormous voter turnout. In fact, Shmuel, who some of you may know, he's our director of development. He's my team fellow. We're work together on stuff. And Shmuel originally is from Netanya, and he went to Netanya on that day to help his parents go to vote, to pick them up and bring them to their poll. And when he was in his parents' apartment building, now it's an apartment building in Netanya, it's a city. You can't really know who votes for what kind of party in a big apartment building, but it is in a neighborhood where there's a lot of religious Zionist people, okay? He said he met there the mayor of Kedumim, one of the communities in Samaria. The mayor of Kedumim himself was there in a t-shirt representing one of the right-wing parties, literally going door to door, knocking on doors and saying, can we help you get to the polls? So, that was an enormous level of grassroots activity to get everybody out. As a result of the higher voter turnout, now one of the things that happens in Israel is that it's not just who you vote for and the percentage of votes that any given party gets, but there is a threshold. Only parties that get a certain percentage of the vote, it's usually more than 3.5% of the vote, ends up being a Knesset. What that translates into is that you have to end up getting the equivalent of 4 Knesset seats, or you get nothing. But the actual number of votes that are required to meet that threshold goes up the more people come out and vote. What happened, therefore, was because there was such a high voter turnout, the threshold, the number of votes needed for any given party to enter the Knesset went up. And as a result, 2 left-wing parties did not meet the threshold. One was Balad, which is the most extreme Arab party. This is a party that was originally led by literally a terrorist and a spy and a traitor and someone who ran away from Israel because they had discovered that he was giving information to Syria, okay? That's the kind of party it is. Now, they're not all traitors in that party, of course, but they are coming from such an extreme position that, you know, we were all very, very happy that they did not pass the threshold. The other party that didn't pass the threshold was Meretz. And Meretz is a far left-wing Jewish party, although they have Arabs in that party as well. But it is very liberal, very secular, and off the charts left-wing. So we were very pleased that those parties did not pass the threshold. What did we end up with? We ended up with a definitive answer as to what the country wants. The country voted solidly right-wing. Benjamin Netanyahu now commands a coalition of 64 members of Knesset, which is, you know, gives them even leeway. When you only have 61, there are 120 members of Knesset in the Knesset. When you only have 61, you have a bare majority. And what that means is that any one member of Knesset can line up and extort the prime minister for whatever he wants, because he knows he loses one member of Knesset on his team, he loses the government. Once you have 64, you have much more. I mean, it's not 74 for sure, but 64 is already considered to be something that gives the prime minister a solid block and solid authority to pass legislation, to implement policies. And this is considered a very good thing. I would say even people on the left who don't like Netanyahu, we're very happy that we have a stable government. Because once you have a stable government and you have a meeting of the minds of the kind of policies that you want to put forward, you can get things done. One of the biggest problems in the previous temporary governments that we had for a few years was that they couldn't pass a budget. A government cannot work. When you don't pass a budget, what happens is your previous budget continues on. You can't make changes. You can't, make adjustments, and you can't respond to needs. And this actually was a problem because during COVID, clearly there was a need for new budgets. Your health system needed a lot more funding than it did previously. So they were able to pass emergency legislation and get assistance because it was universally recognized that you needed more funding for hospitals, clinics, doctors, and testing and all that other stuff. But it's just an example, things that were not as much as consensus, but that suddenly come up, it became a real problem. Thank God, one of the good things that happened with this past government was they were able to have a budget. And so there are people, though, who, even though this budget may not reflect their priorities, it is always good to have a budget. The whole world now is facing a very serious economic crisis, and Israel is no exception. We are facing a very high and steadily rising cost of living. Housing prices are out of sight in Israel. And these are economic issues that must be dealt with. And my attitude about this is that there are a lot of different economic theories, okay? And each minister of finance is going to find his economic advisors who are going to direct him in a particular direction. And it will take into account the priorities. But very often, any given economic policy is going to help so long as it's consistent. Your biggest damage comes when you have conflicting economic policies that are going on at the same time. And so even if you're going to have an economic policy that may not reflect what somebody or other thinks on the left, it may have more budgets to this and less budgets to something else. The very fact that it's a consistent budget and a consistent economic policy will certainly, I believe, go a long way to strengthening the economy. So that's, basically an overview of what the country looks like today. If I go back to who are the parties that are part of this coalition, Likud with 32, they have fewer members than they did, okay? They had 35, now they have 32. But they still are the largest party in the Knesset. Second to largest party was Yesh Atid with 24 seats, but of course that's on the opposite side of the line, the opposite side of the aisle. The next party in the coalition, which was the third largest, was the Religious Zionism Party with 14. This is a record high. And This is a party that, let's say, traditionally was a party that commands people's support, people like me, okay? Religious Zionists, these are people, we are not ultra-Orthodox. Ultra-Orthodox are religious people, they're very devoted, they pray, they study Bible, but they tend to support a more cloistered way of looking at things. And economically, they're way in a different place because they believe that their young men should not be serving in the army. They believe that their young men should not be working, and they should be studying Bible and receiving government subsidies. This is something that I very much disagree with, okay? I believe that we need to be studying Bible and working, and studying Bible and being out there and talking to everybody and being part of the general society. So while the ultra-Orthodox parties and the religious Zionist parties have a lot of things in common, for example, we value Bible study and we want religious education to be widely available for anyone who wants it. We also want to keep the atmosphere of the Shabbat and not have people working on Shabbat and not have too much public transportation on Shabbat, whereas people like me are going to be more interested in ensuring that secular people and traditional people feel comfortable in Israel and that religion doesn't become something imposed, which therefore turns off people. The ultra-Orthodox are just more concerned in making sure what they want, they get, and everybody else wants, well, that's what it is. So the fact now that the Religious Zionist Party is larger than either of the other two ultra-Orthodox parties is very, very interesting, okay? One of the reasons is this so large, though, is that they teamed up with a man named Itamar Ben-Gvir, who I'm sure you're reading about in the newspapers because the foreign media is extremely interested in him. Now, Itamar Ben-Gvir started out his life as what we call a hilltop youth. He was a radical troublemaker, okay? Much of what he said made sense, but he took it to an extreme. He would make statements against Arabs as a whole. All Arabs are bad, all Arabs are murderers, which of course is not correct and not an appropriate thing to say. He would often be involved in violent skirmishes with the army or with different people. And that's how he was as a teenager. Very interesting story about Itamar Ben-Gvir, religious fellow, okay? As a young man, teenager, I don't know, maybe he was 18, 19, something like that. He was arrested for something, and he's a very smart guy, okay? He was arrested, and he was on trial, and then he appealed. And when he got to the Court of Appeals, I think he even went all the way up to the Supreme Court on this issue, and he's standing before a Supreme Court justice by the name of Aaron Barak, who is seen as responsible for the biggest legal changes, revolutions in the country. This goes back, a number of years ago already, to create a much more activist Supreme Court. And you have this kind of situation in other countries where you have people on the left tending to look for a more activist Supreme Court, and you have people on the right looking for a more conservative Supreme Court. And this man, Aaron Barak, was the darling of the left, and he was responsible for creating precedents in law that it was a much more activist Supreme Court, which means, by the way, this becomes relevant in what we'll discuss, the rest of this meeting afterwards, is that when the Knesset passes legislation, the Supreme Court really was only able to throw out legislation if it actually violated a particular constitutional or other law. Okay, so for example, if the Knesset were to pass a law that said if you see an Arab in the street, you can kill him. Of course, this would never happen, but I'm giving a very extreme example. Of course, the Supreme Court would throw that out and say that's illegal. It violates the law. You're not allowed to kill somebody, and therefore they throw it out. What Aaron Barak did, he expanded that idea, and he said, well, the Supreme Court can decide if something makes sense, if it is moral, if it is ethical, if it is reasonable. And all these things actually then become not objective standards, but subjective standards. And this is one of the problems we've been having in Israel, because right-wing legislation that is passed by clear majority in the Knesset is often thrown out by the Supreme Court because they have a much more left-wing view, and they'll say this is unethical or this is not reasonable. And what's reasonable? I think something is reasonable. Someone else thinks something else is reasonable. Okay. Anyway, why is this interesting? Because it was when Itamar Ben-Gvir standing in front of this extremely liberal Supreme Court judge, and he argues his case. The Supreme Court judge was extremely impressed, and he said, young man, you need to go to law school. And Itamar Ben-Gvir went to law school. And it was amazing. Two things happened with him. First of all, over the years, he grew up, he became mature, he understood that you can't be a racist and you can't be violent, and you can stick to your right-wing positions, but you need to implement them in a normal, political, legal way. At the same time, by becoming a lawyer, he learned how to defend the rights of people that he would see as often that had been injured in some way by a system who had a left-wing bias. So he became a lawyer that was extremely out there advocating for all kinds of things. For example, if illegal, a pioneering outpost kind of community is there, and the army decides to come and take it down because it's not legal, he would go and argue on its behalf, and sometimes he won and sometimes he didn't, depending on what the legal situation really was. So he became very well known for this. He's also a very provocative kind of guy. So on the one hand, his positions are typical right-wing positions. We're in favor of sovereignty in Judea and Samaria. We're in favor of a strong police and law and order. We're in favor of a strong IDF, a strong army, and making sure we defend ourselves properly. A typical right-wing hawkish type of position. But on the other hand, some of the things he does are extremely provocative, for good or for bad. For example, this past year, there had been ongoing violence going on against Jews who live in the eastern parts of Jerusalem. Day after day, people would park their car next to their homes, and Arabs would come and burn up their cars, throw Molotov cocktails into their homes. It was an untenable situation. And the people were complaining to the police, and the police weren't doing anything. Why weren't the police doing anything? It's very similar to how police behave very often if you have nice people living in bad neighborhoods. There are certain neighborhoods that very often police all over the world will say, we're not going into that neighborhood because it's too dangerous. It's insane when you think about it. But we all know of cities around the world where police have given up on going into those cities because they say they're just a bunch of criminals and we're not going in. Here you have a situation, though, where you have Jewish families living in those areas because this is Jerusalem, because they want to make sure that we little by little buy property and ensure a Jewish presence in Jerusalem, even in neighborhoods that unfortunately have been taken over by Arabs, okay? The Arabs there, some of them are just petty criminals, but some of them are fighting an ideological battle. They're trying to drive the Jews out because they don't want the Jews in Jerusalem. They don't want the Jews anywhere. And this is a place where if the state of Israel is going to assert its sovereignty, it has to go in and take care of this stuff. And so what happened was Itamar Ben-Gvir goes, he was a member of Knesset, he goes, he puts his office in the middle of the neighborhood, and he says, I'm not leaving until I see some law and order in this place. I look at that and I say, bravo. Here he is looking after these people and standing for what is good and right in the state of Israel. But there are other people who will say it's provocative. You are just encouraging more violence, because the very presence of someone like Itamar Ben-Gvir, when an Arab looks at him or hears his name, he goes bazooties. I say, so what? Other people will say, there may be calmer ways to deal with this. True. There may well be calmer ways to deal with it. And in the end, Itamar Ben-Gvir leaves, and the police find calmer ways to deal with it. But sometimes you need that provocative guy to raise the awareness of where the problem is. As a result of all this, combination of how he was as a teenager and some of these provocative actions, Itamar Ben-Gvir has gotten a reputation of a racist, of a, I don't know, violent guy, which is really not true. Okay. Now, there are some statements that are made by people in this party that I would say is a bit extreme. I wouldn't go so far. Okay. But I also think to go so far to say that he's a very problematic person is that in itself is extreme. All right. So what happened was he's part of that party, but he has created an enormous following because especially there are a lot of young people out there who are taking a look at what has happened in the country, and they're looking and seeing that the police are not fighting back enough. The armies, and we're talking about within Israel, there were terrible, terrible riots a year and a half ago in the mixed cities in Israel, Lod and Akko and places like this where Arabs and Jews live together, not in Judea and Samaria, in these other cities. And people came away from that very scarred, Israelis, Jews, and they said, we need to be doing more to stop this violence. Otherwise, it will spread because these people are getting more and more, emboldened, and we're seeing them allying themselves. Israeli citizens who are Arabs, more and more are allying themselves with the extremists among the Palestinians, and that has to stop. And therefore, a lot of young people voted for that party, even though they themselves are not religious Zionists. They're secular, but they're right-wing. They're patriotic. And that's the reason he got so many votes. Okay, so I use some of these examples to kind of give you a more in-depth understanding of the Israeli political scene on the right. But bottom line, we have Likud with 32. We have religious Zionism with 14, which includes Ben-Gvir and his people. We have Shas, which is the ultra-Orthodox Sephardi party with 11. And Yahadut Torah, United Torah Judaism, which is the ultra-Orthodox Ashkenazi party with 7 seats for a total of 64 seats. Okay. Right now, as we speak, Netanyahu is already carrying out negotiations with these 3 parties to come and reach a coalition. One of the issues that is now being debated and that all 3 of these parties are insisting on when they talk to Netanyahu is a law. We talked before about Aaron Barak and his judicial revolution, where he basically made everything justiciable. Every type of issue could come before the Supreme Court and enable the Supreme Court to overrule Knesset legislation on a regular basis on these kind of justifications. It's not reasonable, it's not moral, it's not ethical, which are completely subjective standards. One of the biggest issues that these 3 parties are insisting on is that Netanyahu back legislation, that if that happens, if the Knesset has passed legislation, if someone takes it to the Supreme Court, if the Supreme Court knocks it down, it can go back to the Knesset, and the Knesset can then overrule the Supreme Court. And that is a new piece of legislation that is very important to all 3 parties. And I think this is a very, very important piece of legislation. And frankly, I think it's important right now. We feel it's important because we're on the right. And while there are some right-wing justices of the Supreme Court, and in fact, thanks to Ayelet Shaked, when she was Minister of Justice a year or 2 ago, she was able to put through some wonderful conservative appointees to the Supreme Court and to other courts. So we're in a better situation than we used to be. But it is very, very important that regardless of who is on the Supreme Court, if you have a Supreme Court, let's say that's mostly right-wing, and you have a Knesset that's mostly left-wing, the same thing. It is the Knesset that represents the will of the people. And if you have a piece of legislation that is passed by the majority of the Knesset, which represents the will of the people, the Supreme Court should only be able to knock it down if it is indeed unconstitutional or illegal, not because it's not reasonable. That becomes too subjective. So this, okay, is where we are today. How does this affect Judea and Samaria? And with this, I will conclude this portion of our discussion. This is a right-wing government. This is a government that is very in favor of Judea and Samaria. Now, the biggest people who are going to push for Judea and Samaria are the 14 members of the religious Zionist party. That's are the ones we can rely on. The Likud has a lot of right-wing people, but they don't care as much about this. so they can be moved in either direction. Netanyahu has been known to make promises to bring right-wing pro-settlement votes, and then when it comes down to it, all he needs is a phone call from the President of the United States, and he backs down. But in previous election campaigns, Netanyahu had promised he's going to extend sovereignty, he's going to enable new communities, and nothing happened. We have Daniela Weiss, who was one of the founders of the settlement movement. I had a conversation with her the day before the election. And she told me she had a video recording of Netanyahu just the day before, promising her that indeed Evyatar, which is that community that the previous government promised to set up and never did. He promised, he said, the other government promised, I'm going to actually do it. So I said to her, do you believe him? She said, probably. She says, I can't rely on his promise, but I can rely on his promise to put it before him as a debt. Okay, you go. It's on tape, and she could say, Netanyahu, this is what you promised. I'm coming to collect on my promise. And this is very important. So for us, it's important that we have that party with 14 seats, because they're the ones who are going to go to Netanyahu and say, time to collect on your promises. Okay. The one thing that does concern us, though, is the continuing power of the ultra-Orthodox. And again, as I mentioned, what concerns me most is in religious issues. As a person who is religious, it is very important to me that we are reaching out to all of Israel and enabling them to see the beauty of Judaism, enabling them to understand the underlying spirituality of Judaism, and not just be creating political fights over this and that way of observing Judaism. And the Haredi parties, the ultra-Orthodox parties in the past have not been very good with that. The religious Zionist parties and even the Likud have been better with that. But very often you have someone like Netanyahu, who was a secular person who doesn't really care very much about religious issues, giving them whatever they want because he needs them to support his whatever political issues are. And so I'm hoping that all of the people in these parties will realize, even though they have power, they cannot do what the opposition did, what they did in opposition. They cannot do that, because that will just perpetuate the tension that exists within the country. While putting forward policies that the majority of the country want, they have to reach out to the rest of the country and say, we want to hear you. We want to know what you feel. And a lot of the people have things that they want to discuss that don't come up against any ideological issues of the right. They want to know, how are you solving the housing crisis? They want to say, don't give all your money to the ultra-Orthodox to support people who don't work. I'm a working individual and I need help buying an apartment because the prices are so high. If this government can realize that it cannot just use its power to get money for what it wants, but needs to also be conciliatory to what everybody wants, then this government could be very successful. If it perpetuates the conflict within the society, then unfortunately we will see more arguing, more fighting, more politics, and that's something that at least I would be very, very sorry to see. Because we're not just about how many communities we can develop and how many soldiers we have, but we need to make sure that we have a nation that feels proud to be in Israel, connected to one another, and doesn't feel that one side is trying to force them into something that they cannot live with. So that's politics. I just want to conclude, and I do promise to leave time for a Q&A. I just want to conclude with a few short things. First of all, we like to focus on a particular community. And this time I want to focus more on a region. The Hebron Hills Regional Council just celebrated 40 years. It was their 40th anniversary to the establishment of the municipality itself. A regional municipality in Judea and Samaria means it is the regional umbrella over which there are many number of small communities. And whenever you have communities that each community itself is too small to have its own municipality, they come together, they have their own committee, they have their own volunteer mayor, administrator, but they're all coming together under a regional municipality. So communities like Beit Yatir and Susia and Shani Livna and Avigail are just, and Tena Omarim and Telem and Adurat. These are just some of the communities that are in the Hebron Hills. These are all areas that's south of Hebron, between Hebron and Beersheba. And they just celebrate their 40th anniversary. They had a wonderful, wonderful event during the holiday of Sukkot where we went. And it was a festival, it was a concert, it was, very, very exciting. But it's just really important to remember where everything began. The very first community in the Hebron Hills was Beit Yatir. And Beit Yatir to this day is an agricultural moshav. They have a wonderful dairy farm. Some of you, I think, have been there with me. They produce enormous quantities of milk. I remember taking a group of Dutch people there, some of whom were dairy farmers in the Netherlands, and they were astounded at the quantity of milk that is being produced in the dairy farms in Beit Yatir. And then we pulled out that verse that talks about, in Judah, that they will have so much milk, or they'll have milk and grapes. They'll be washing their clothes in grapes, and then the milk will be like white as their teeth, something like that. There's some verse about that with the blessing of Judah. And so it's just great, because when you're there in Beit Yatir, they have vineyards. And in fact, they have a winery in Yatir, the Yatir winery, and they have these wonderful dairy cows. And so you're standing there, remember, even years and years ago, standing there in Beit Yatir and really believing that here was a community where you could actually feel these promises and the blessings of Judah coming true there in Beit Yatir. And this is a very small community. It's grown in the past years, of course, and it's a place we've been involved with really from the beginning. And over the years, we've helped them with a youth center and playgrounds and security equipment and a daycare center. And I just got a call from the administrator of Beit Yatir this morning, and he's saying to me that they now have an elderly population. Well, if you're the oldest community in the Hebron Hills, your founders are today in their 70s. And some are older. And so they want to put together a center, some kind of a senior center. And he wanted to know if we could help. And I said, write it up and send it. We will do our best. And so it was I thought it was a wonderful opportunity to tell you a bit about that community. And finally, I want to end with a small Bible teaching. This past week, we read wonderful, wonderful Torah portion of Genesis 12, where God says to Abraham, go forth from your country, from your birthplace, from the house of your father to the land that I will show you. And indeed, this God's calling to Abraham begins the story of the Jewish people, and it begins right away at the beginning with the story of the connection between the land of Israel and the Jewish people, because just a few verses later, God says to Abraham, I will give this land to your children. And from then on, really, the Bible becomes a story of the God of Israel, people of Israel, and the land of Israel, and the connection between them. And that, of course, is very exciting. Actually, we talked about the celebration of the Hebron Hills during Sukkot. Also during Sukkot, there was another celebration of 55-year anniversary since the liberation of Judea and Samaria. And we had a hike to Sebastia, which was the site of a big gathering that began the first community in Samaria, which happened at the end of 1975. So, I feel like we were, during that holiday Feast of Tabernacles, we're just celebrating all these wonderful beginnings of settlement in both directions, Judea and Samaria. And that first initiative was started by a group that called themselves the Elon Moreh group. It was the Oak of Moreh group, because the original idea was to settle somewhere near or at the Oak of Moreh, which is what we read about in Genesis 12, where God first promised the land to Abraham. But anyway, right after that, in verse 10, we learn that there's a famine in the land. So here's Abraham, listened to God, left everything behind, comes to a land, God promises the land. He goes from the Oak of Moreh, goes down to Bethel, and he starts moving south, and everything is great. And all of a sudden he has a famine, and what does he do? He leaves the land. And that raises enormous questions. First of all, you can imagine how Abram felt. Here he is coming to this new land, full of promise, full of optimism. And the first thing that happens, he has a famine and he can't stay. He's got to leave. I mean, you can imagine he's going to say, what's going on? It's the same kind of question that he would have asked, of course, much more seriously, when God tells him, after he finally has a son, one son, and it's this son that God says, Isaac, that all the promises will go through Isaac. And then God says, I'll go take him and sacrifice him. You know, and you have to say, what's going on here? So that's a much more critical question. But here, at a lesser level, it's the same question. God's promising a land. He brings me here after this whole journey. I've got to leave. So that's one question. And the other question is a question that basically, was Abraham right to leave? Now, there's one very important commentator that says something that almost nobody else says, but it's still worth considering. He says Abraham sinned and that he left the land. He should have stayed put and trusted God to bring him what he needed, even through a famine. Now, almost all the other commentators disagree. They say, no, you can't just sit around and wait for God to feed you. If there's a famine, you've got to figure it out. He went to Egypt only temporarily, and then he came back. Okay, so I would say the debate is out there, and you can take it any way you want. But if I look at both of the situation, what we have here is that Abraham is suddenly faced with a situation that doesn't seem to make sense given the promise he has just received from God. And he could say to him, what am I supposed to do? And he doesn't really know. Should he leave the land or should he stay? And his faith question, what does God want from me? He just told me he's giving me the land and he made me come to this land. Now I have to leave the land? And I think this is something that we can all relate to. There are times in our life when we are very clear on what God wants us to be doing in general. But then we get to a particular crossroads and we have to decide, what does he want me to do now? Based upon the general direction, now what I do. And sometimes the answer to that is not clear. And I think when we look at politics, and we just went through a whole analysis, I think it is all clear that God wants us to be settling the land, and he wants a strong state of Israel, and he wants the nation of Israel to be unified. The question is, how do we get there? We had a government, the last government. Some people would have said, I look at that like Abraham's going down to Egypt. Someone said, you should never have done that. Some people said, it was okay. The point is that so long as you keep the ultimate goal, we should be here, we should be settling, we should be strong. How you get there and how you make a given decision, it's very hard to know which was the right and which was the wrong decision. And so I would say that the important thing as we face the decisions, first of all, very hard for us to judge people who make specific decisions. Don't assume that because he made a decision that you don't like, that he doesn't have the ultimate goal, that's a good goal, in mind. And we talk about Israel, I would say the same thing. We need to be constantly seeking God's direction. We need to constantly keep in mind the direction God wants us to be going in. But that doesn't mean that it will always be clear how to get to that ultimate goal. And we should work together to put our wisdom together to try to get there. But recognize that there may be this way to get there and this way to get there. And all we can do is do our best. And keep in mind the ultimate goal. The ultimate goal is a strong Israel, return of the Jewish people to Israel, settlement throughout the land of Israel. These are ultimate goals in our whole existence here in Israel. And we just have to hope and pray that God gives us the wisdom to make the right choices of how to get to that ultimate goal. Anyway, that is I talked a very long time. So please open up your mics and I'd love to hear what you have to say.
Sorry, Sondra, but I was thinking you mentioned about Abraham going down into Egypt, but the same thing happened with Joseph, didn't it? Yeah, there was a famine in the land. Where did they go? They went down to Egypt.
Right.
The food.
Actually, well, I'll tell you something. That one commentator who said that Abraham should not have gone down to Egypt, he goes even further, and he says that the actual descent of the nation of Israel, or the family of Jacob, that ends up becoming the nation of Israel, to Egypt was actually a punishment for the fact that Abraham went down to Egypt. You can accept that or disagree with it, but it's a very interesting connection between those two things.
I don't think God plays games with us.
No, I don't mean a game. I mean, God does. It's not a game.
Options.
I think God is setting a path of history, and how we interpret it is not always going to be the same.
Exactly. Yeah. You choose.
Can I ask, what's happened to Naphtali Bennett and Gideon Sa'ar?
Okay, well, those are two very different people. Naphtali Bennett, when the government fell in June, he made the announcement that he was leaving politics. So he remained in place in the government because until when a government falls, until you have elections, no changes can be made in a government. Whoever has a particular, he handed over the prime minister to the alternative prime minister, was Yair Lapid, but he remained the alternative prime minister. But now he is resigning. He's resigning already, which he can do. And he did not run for the Knesset. He resigned his place in the party, which actually created a total collapse of the Yamina party, which I think was unfortunate. People went in many different directions. So it looks like Bennett is going to be out of politics for a while. He's a very talented man. He spent some time years ago. He started a company and had an enormous exit, sold it for a lot of money, which is why he is an independently wealthy man. It's very possible he will go back to doing that kind of work for a while. He may come back into politics. No one knows right now. Gideon Sa'ar, he merged his party with that National Unity Party, which was the right-wing part of that party. And some of the people who had been in Yamina and Bennett's party joined that as well. So Gideon Sa'ar is in the Knesset, but they are for now in the opposition. Now, there are a number of people that are thinking that that would be a very good party to join the Netanyahu government, particularly the people in that party who are right-wing. Now, one thing that's very interesting, by the way, I mentioned that Gantz was seen very often as left-wing. 2 days before the election, Gantz made a statement he had never made before. He said he was against the two-state solution. And all of a sudden we said, whoa, So he's clear. Gantz, the fellow who's in charge of the National Unity Party, okay, that was the Ministry of Defense, still the Minister of Defense now until he is going to be replaced. But he really can't stand Netanyahu. They did work together 2 years ago, and he felt terribly manipulated by Netanyahu, and that wasn't being honest with him. And so at this point, he's not willing to even consider being part of a Netanyahu government. But who knows? That is a place to look. Will that party fall apart and some of the people join the Likud government? Because some of those people are former Likudniks, they may join. Will that party join? Will Gantz change his mind and say, okay, I'm willing to give Netanyahu another chance? Or will they remain in the opposition, where they then will become the more right wing of the various opposition parties? Time will tell. A good person to look at.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, Sondra. A big thank you for your overview of what's happening in Israel now, because in the UK, our main source of media is pretty left-wing and very pro-Palestinian. So it's good to give us a good overview. And
thank you, John. Thank you.
Yeah.
Same in Australia.
Well, at the moment, you've probably seen our political soap opera.
Oh, boy.
Yeah, and we do have the same Prime Minister this week as last week. Anyway, big thank you.
Wow, yes, the UK system is a mess. We see that. Absolutely. Does anyone else have something they'd like to comment on or say?
Sondra, I'd like to ask, Mark speaking, I'd like to ask about the recent agreement with Lebanon. Is that agreement to Israel's advantage? Why did Israel sign that agreement? Was pressure put on them to bear? And also, what is the status of that agreement now that the election has been concluded?
Okay, great questions. The Lebanon agreement was very controversial. It's an agreement that actually had been worked on already for quite some time. Netanyahu's government had already also been involved with it beforehand, and now Bennett, and then it moved to Lapid. The biggest controversy there was the fact that there was an area of disagreement, and Israel seems to have given up its claim to that area. And the question that is out there is, number one, how strong was Israel's claim to begin with? And number two, what does it mean when they gave up that area? Did they completely give it up, or they just said because there are people who claim it didn't set the international boundary, it just set the commercial rights to that maritime area, and not necessarily the same as an international boundary. One of the things that was very disturbing to me in the entire discussion of all this, on the one hand, the military was very in favor of this government because they felt it would diffuse the power of Hezbollah and remove the threat coming from Hezbollah to attack the Karish oil rig, which was about to start, not oil, gas, natural gas rig, which was about to start pumping. And of course, Hezbollah was threatening to, and had already tried to attack it. Now we have, IDF is very good at protecting it, but there's nothing foolproof. And so there was a feeling that if we could diffuse their influence and power on that, and at the same time, give Lebanon some kind of economic anchorage, because they too will now be able to look for natural gas in their part of the area, then that's good, because that can also weaken Hezbollah and the influence of Iran in Lebanon. I don't know. And in other words, it's very hard to tell who is the right on this issue. What I do feel very strongly about is that it was absolutely wrong for Lapid to push it through.
Yes.
And it was pushed through without a proper Knesset debate. And when you have an election of this importance, and you don't put it before the Knesset so that people can really hear the debate, and people can vote, and people consider it. And his answer was the reason he didn't want to put it before the Knesset because it wouldn't pass. Well, that's a little stupid. What he could have done is two things: either put it before the Knesset, or he could have said, we're waiting, there's elections, we'll wait until there's a new government, whichever government that will be, whether it be his government or Netanyahu's government. Let's have a stable Knesset and then put it before the Knesset. And that would have been a lot fairer. The other thing, I didn't hear anybody, and I have a legal background, and I had a number of questions about this. What is under international law? What is the effect of this agreement? How concrete and how important are these different lines that have been set? Because there are different lines, and I'm not quite sure what they all mean. And of all the people that were interviewed, they kept talking about the militaries behind it, but they never brought international legal experts on either side that discussed it. And I think that was part of what should have been a healthy public debate that was missing. But once an agreement is signed by the sovereign government, there is a doctrine in international law that the government following has to follow it, which, by the way, is the only reason why Biden has not closed the embassy in Jerusalem. It works the same way, because the decision to recognize Jerusalem and to put the embassy in Jerusalem was a decision taken by a sovereign American government and president. And therefore, for Biden to try to cancel that is going to put him in trouble with the law, in the same way that if Netanyahu will come in and try to cancel Lapid's agreement to this Lebanon deal, might also be problematic. Time will tell. That's all I can say. Time will tell.
Sondra, how do you define a religious Jew? I mean, you get someone like Netanyahu, and I'm not suggesting he's religious by any means, but he does appear to read the Torah portion. He certainly goes out of his way to align himself with evangelical Christians. Where does he fit in the spectrum?
Netanyahu is a completely and total secular Jew. He doesn't observe any of the commandments. He's a very strong, I don't know if he ever goes to synagogue except when it looks good for him politically. Okay? He does not pray in the morning. I mean, this is known. This is not, I'm not saying because I snuck into his living room and looked. This is how he defines himself. Okay. However, because he has seen that his most important allies are religious people, there are very often things he will do or say, or places he will show up, because he wants them to support him. Okay. On the other hand, he's a strong Zionist and a proud Jew. His love of the Bible is authentic. I don't know if he believes God wrote it. I doubt it. But he definitely believes that it is the most important historical document of the Jewish people. It is our cultural and historical heritage. And that, by the way, it is a thought that's shared by the vast majority of Jews in Israel, that whether or not they believe God wrote the Bible, they believe that the Bible is a very defining document that we need to pay attention to. In the same way that in any country, you have your founding fathers, you have your foundational documents, you have your early history, okay? And how sacred that is for any country, whether or not God wrote the story or not. And so that's really where you would put Netanyahu. But there are many people in the Likud party who are indeed religious people, very much so. People with kippot, and then there's some people without a kippah that are still religious people, but they don't want to wear a kippah for whatever reason. Kippah itself is not that important. It ends up being more an issue of identification than anything else.
Netanyahu's brother gave his life for Israel. I can't see Netanyahu backing down from anything. He's Israel through and through and through.
Oh, he's a strong patriot, no question.
Strong.
No
Praise
question.
God.
No question.
Yeah.
But he's not a religious man. But that's okay. That's
As long as
okay.
he's for Israel, I'll
we
take
need
it.
to be, and I think his embrace of evangelical Christians is because they are so staunchly supportive of Israel. Okay?
Yeah.
Evangelical Christians, they pray morning, noon, and night. But if they're from the brand of evangelical Christians who are anti-Israel, he's not going to have anything to do with them.
No.
As neither will I, regardless of whether they pray and I pray. Yeah. We can both pray, but that doesn't mean that we're going to be friends if we aren't unified on these very important issues.
I'm on God's side, pro-Israel. Forget the rest.
Good. Sondra, if you went into politics, I would vote for you.
God forbid.
But what I wanted to, following on from Barry's question, can you explain a bit more about the religious Zionists? Because I remember when I lived in Israel, I used to see these guys walking around with a kippah on, and they were religious, but they weren't extreme.
That's it. That's who we are.
Right.
Like Christians from one side to the other.
Like Christians.
They're
thousand variations in between.
A religious Zionist is someone who's, look, everybody's actual religious observance, to the extent that they keep every iota less and more, that's very individual. But as a matter of principle, a religious Jew believes that the commandments that God gave to us are binding, okay? Yes. That we have a tradition of centuries going from Moses to today that continues to develop the commandments so that they accommodate, new times, but they coming from the same spirit and same principles that were handed to us in the Bible, and that remains binding. So that means, for example, we rest on the Shabbat. We don't work on the Shabbat. We don't drive, on the Shabbat or something, and we keep kosher. And these are the basic rules. And then there's other things that some people are more careful about and others are less careful about. But it's, this is a religious person. A religious Zionist is someone who believes that the establishment of the state of Israel is not just a political event. It's not just an event that is good for the Jewish people because now we have a safe place to live, but that it is in and of itself a part of the redemption.
Yes.
That it fulfills the promises and prophecies in the Bible. That's a religious Zionist. Okay.
Absolutely.
So a religious Zionist is going to want to take part in the full society of Israel, because the society of Israel in and of itself is God's plan. Now, that doesn't mean everybody in Israeli society is a righteous person. Of course not. But we want to be part of that society. We want to, for example, theater is important to us. Does every play that going out on the theater is a good play? No. And some of them may be counter to some of our values, but we want to be in that scene. So we want to have people we want to have plays and theaters that will reflect biblical values as part of the scene. Okay. We want to, we're going to go to university. We want to be scholars. We want to be accountants and lawyers and doctors. We want to take part in every part of society, but we go into these fields with the religious background and with spiritual values. what happens in the ultra-Orthodox society, people who go to work are considered people who didn't manage to stay and study Bible all day long. It's like a, what can I say? It's not ideal, okay? And someone told me of a very interesting conversation, and it just reflects it all. You know, they go to doctors like we go to doctors, okay? But there's almost the only ultra-Orthodox doctors are people who started out not being ultra-Orthodox, and after they're already doctors, became ultra-Orthodox, okay? So there was a fellow, there was a doctor who's religious Zionist, and an ultra-Orthodox fellow was complaining to him about a doctor who doesn't enough appreciate biblical values as a doctor. And this guy said to him, well, if you would encourage your children to go study medicine, maybe they would come into the medical field with your values. And he said, oh, no, we'll never do that. So, you know, that's the difference.
Want to have it both ways.
I just find it interesting, Sondra, because I think I mentioned before, I'm involved in an Orthodox rabbis webinar. Yes. And I've learned a lot from being involved with that. But it is a kind of the emphasis is on legalism as far as I'm concerned, because you know we Christians we read the Tanakh as written by God,
right? Yeah? So do we.
Yeah, and we learn about how God is from reading the Scripture, but in the Orthodox way, it's a matter of how you do certain rituals. Making sure
so I would modify that. I would say, especially outside of Israel, some people sometimes lose track of some of the broader issues because they're living in a non-Jewish state. And so they get their general concepts from their basic environment and what sets them apart, how they act, how they live, how they behave. And so it may look like legalistic. It really isn't. I'm just as concerned about the legal what I need to be doing legally. Okay, that's important to me. But why is it important to me? Because when God said, obey the Sabbath, that's all he said. But I need to know how he wants me to do that. And so we have a long oral tradition that gets into major details into how that needs to happen, where I believe that this is centuries of Jewish thinking and traditions passing down from Moses to today, helping us understand how to best obey God's commandment as written in the Bible. But you've got to also be able to see the bigger picture. And that's one of the things that I criticize rabbis abroad more than here, okay? Because you have many rabbis abroad who have trouble stepping out of that, not to erase that, stepping out of that and then saying, my goodness, let's read the promises of the Bible. Look what's happening in Israel today. That's the most important thing. That's amazing. And they don't always see that because they're trapped in their little corner, sitting in London or Melbourne or New York City. When they get out of those corners, it usually helps open up when they come to Israel. It can give you a whole different perspective.
Yes, you're sounding like a Zionist, Sondra.
I am.
I'm involved in prayer for Israel because Scripture says we should be praying for Israel. So I'm involved in prayer for Israel, but I'm also doing a Torah study. I'm involved in two different directions, but Israel and the living God's the focus for both.
Excellent, but that's great. And as long as we're studying and thinking and talking to other people, we're always growing.
Yes. Praise God.
Thank you, Sondra. Anyone else with questions before we close off this most precious time?
I wonder a little bit about the opposition parties. I mean, the far left-wing Meretz is out of Knesset now, and I think the Labour is also a clear left-wing party, has only 4 seats. You may correct me if I'm wrong. But the other Jewish opposition parties, are they really left-wing? Are they not more like just secular parties in the middle?
Okay, so we have as follows. We have 10 seats belonging to 2 Arab parties. One party is been very in favor of, have recognized the state of Israel as a Jewish state and in favor of more cooperation. I am hoping that while I'm not keen to have that party be part of the government, I'm hoping that the new government will reach out to them, because we do need to have a positive dialogue with those Arabs who recognize Israel as a Jewish state. So those are the 10 Arab seats. The Labour Party has 4 seats, and they are definitely a very left-wing party, ideological rivals on us on almost every issue. Okay. Then you have Lieberman's party. He has 6 votes. Yisrael Beitenu. He is a right-wing guy who hates Netanyahu. So he's not left-wing at all. So it's kind of an anomaly that he is going to be in opposition together with the 10 Arab members of Knesset and the 4 Labour Party, who are all very, very left-wing. And then you have Yesh Atid, which is Lapid's party, 24 seats. He's going to be the head of the opposition because he's the head of the largest party in the opposition. His party is left of center, with a lot of people in that party who are really center and not so left. Certainly, he doesn't agree with the more extreme positions of either the Labour Party or the Arab Party. And then you have the National Unity Party with their 12 seats headed by Gantz, who is in the middle. So a lot depends on how they are going to behave. One of the things that distressed me about the last government was that the right-wing opposition voted down everything, even if it was legislation they agreed with. I would hope that the new opposition would act according to their conscience, and those people who support the legislation the right is putting forward would support it, and if they don't, they vote against it. But way too early to tell, and a lot also will happen. We'll see if this National Unity Party, in part or in whole, actually joins the government at all. So stay tuned.
Interesting days ahead. Thank you, Father God.
Yes, thank you.
Oh, yes.
Thank you, everyone. Did Kim want to say any more, Sondra? Are you there, Kim?
Is she still here? I don't know.
No,
So,
not there.
Sondra, the tour starts tomorrow. When does
tomorrow?
Your tour start?
Yes, that's
yes.
right.
So Sondra is heading off. How many have you got on the tour?
24.
Beautiful.
Handy number. Good.
It's an excellent gathering. So may it really go well and be very profitable, just in the area of people learning and growing in the understanding of, Israel and its people. Israel High.
Absolutely.
And you'll pop in and out, I guess, over the time, just to say hello to everybody, and may it really go well. And I'm sure everybody agrees in some way that we can come on and listen to somebody who has clarity and is going to say it as it is, which is a great avenue for us to rest upon and connect in a sane way as to what is happening. And you know, as lovers of the Holy One of Israel, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, we're just continually looking to the nation that he calls the head of the nations and the light to all the other nations. Amen. Because it'll reflect how our nations will go as well. But it's very heartening. Thank you so much again, Sondra. I don't think words really say how much we are blessed out of our socks to be able to
really
call you a friend, and that you give us your very, very precious time, which is, very compacted in all your activities and reaching out to the communities. Yes. We give our regards to Shmuel. I believe he's back in Israel. Is that right?
He is.
Yeah. We're looking forward to have him come. Shmuel is coming to meet Aussies in February, which is really exciting. And we'll be on our best behavior for him.
if possible. Yeah.
I just must add my little thing about Abraham going down to Egypt. All that kept coming to me was the great mercies of God. You know, he's always prepared for us to make tshuva. Turn from our way to your way, and when we may have stepped out of it, he's so loving and kind to come with great mercy and say, this is not the way, come back. Yes. So I think having been called a friend of God is astounding. And yet, you know, you're able to step off the track, not willingly, disobedient. But yeah, that's my little say. Got a terrible sound.
Thank you, Sondra, so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sondra. And you have the rest of your day ahead of you. We're heading into the evening here, so blessings on your day and everyone at CFOIC.
Yes.
Thank you. Good to see you all. Sondra. See you again next month.
Thank you, Marion.
Thank you, Sondra.
Thank you, Marion.
I hope you enjoyed that film. And we have lots more film content and emails and articles that I'm sure you will enjoy as well. Check out our website at cfoic.com and subscribe to our newsletter. You can do that right from the homepage. I know you will really enjoy the content that will land in your inbox on a regular basis. Hope to see you soon.